Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled How Not to Conduct Human Rights Due Diligence. I'm Adarsh from Q Design, and I will be your technical facilitator today. Chat is disabled for the session, so if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. You will also be able to upvote and comment on the Q&A questions. Please note that the session today is being recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to message me using the Q&A function. I will now hand over to Rishi to start the session.
Thank you, Adarsh. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world. The advantage of technology is that we can talk across time zones and also across regions. So it's certainly my pleasure to be moderating this important discussion on how not to conduct a human rights due diligence. And I see a participant joining in, some dear friends also in that list. Sean, you're there. I see you there. Dinesh, you're there. I see you as well. So please support us in this discussion. I think we need more minds than we have today here. And I hope all of you are doing well and making the most of every moment. I want to quickly thank UNDP for organizing this forum. There's a lot of work which goes in the back end. I want to thank Harpreet, her team. Kevin, you're already here. Thanks a ton for bringing us together. We have a diverse group of panelists, friends here. I thought, sharing of these experiences would really help in demystifying human rights due diligence process. We will do our best to keep it engaging, but we need your help and the friends who are in the participant list, with your questions, your thoughts, your comments, keep them flowing in the Q&A section. The good thing is that we will take many pauses in between to answer your questions and to also share your comments in the group. So please keep them flowing. Our design of today's discussion is very engaging. The discussion is divided into 3 sections. The first section will talk about the nuts and bolts, exactly what is due diligence all about. The second section is about the realities on the ground, and we would like to share exactly what is happening with rights holders. And the third is about solution orientation. So I love talking about solutions, ending any session, on a positive note. So we'll love to see that. We also have a couple of polls, so we'll probably like to see your inputs through using some of the options available on Zoom. We're all learning in this space, so I hope things will work fine. Please get your water, tea, coffee, whatever, for the next 90 minutes, and hope we'll have a good session. So I just wanted to hand it over to Adarsh to start our poll. I see already 28 attendees in the session today. Adarsh, so could you respond to the poll? Nothing is right or wrong here. Just pick up the multiple options of this poll. While you're doing that, I want to introduce our esteemed panelist, Samishta Selvaratnam, who is a business and human rights advisor from Pillar 2. We have Martin, who's the director of administration and natural resources at Natural Denims in Bangladesh. We have Dr. Daniel Aguirre, who's a senior lecturer in law from the University of Roehampton. And we have Sandeep Sachdeva, who's a co-founder and CEO, Safe in India Foundation. Their detailed bios are in the link of this session today, and I encourage you to see that and also to engage with our participants here. So yes, we're waiting for the poll to get over. Others, can you give it a couple of minutes and then close the poll? Yeah, please take a couple of minutes to take this poll. Multiple options. Just choose the option which comes to your mind. There's nothing right or wrong here. Even the panelists, you can also take this poll. So please go ahead. Adarsh, can you close the poll in a minute? So as we're waiting for the poll results, I see more friends joining in. Livio, thanks for joining us. Vidya, thanks for joining us. Pallavi, thanks for joining us. Good to see you guys here. All right, so these are the results of our poll, and it seems like certainly HRDD is not about labor rights. I think that was one of the clear answers which came out. I think the second answer was certainly not a compliance check. And also the third most answered point was it's certainly not for large businesses. And I'm sure there's more to it. And this was just an attempt to kickstart our discussion today. And if you feel HRDD is also not something listed here, you can certainly put that into the Q&A section as a comment. Okay, so let's kickstart our discussion with Samishta. Thanks a ton for joining us from The Hague. We hear a lot about human rights due diligence. Past 10 years, there's so much talk happening about it. What exactly is human rights due diligence? Can you comment on some of the components of it?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Rishi. Very much so looking forward to digging into the nuts and bolts of what human rights due diligence is. I thought it'd be useful to start with what is the main purpose of human rights due diligence, and it's to know and show that a company is respecting human rights, which in turn helps to prevent and address adverse human rights impacts. So it really focuses on risks to people rather than risks to business, and a strong approach to human rights due diligence is critical for risk management and supports a company's drive for positive impact. So I'll go through the 4 key components of the human rights due diligence process, and I thought it would be useful to also chat through what this could look like in practice. So the very first step, identifying and assessing actual or potential adverse human rights impacts that a business may cause or contribute to through its own activities, or which may be directly linked to its operations, products, or services through its business relationships. And so in practice, this could look like conducting a human rights impact assessment for a new project or acquisition, or when entering into a new jurisdiction, as well as consulting with local communities and workers on the ground. The second step is integrating findings from impact assessments across relevant functions and company processes, as well as taking appropriate action according to the business's involvement in the impact. And so there are various ways this can be done in practice, and it could look like conducting internal human rights training for employees, capacity building and human rights awareness to suppliers, and incorporating contractual clauses into agreements with third parties. The third step is tracking the effectiveness of measures and processes to address adverse human rights impacts in order to know if they are working. And so in practice, what we see this can involve is an internal audit of company grievance mechanisms, including those grievance mechanisms available to external parties such as community members, and putting in place human rights related targets, for example, targets around the percentage of staff that receive human rights training. And the fourth and very last step is communicating on how impacts are being addressed and showing stakeholders, in particular affected stakeholders, that there are adequate policies and processes in place to implement respect for human rights in practice. So this may be publicly responding to allegations of human rights abuse, informal dialogue with civil society, unions, and investors, as well as reporting in annual reports or corporate sustainability reports. And the UNGPs are very clear that businesses should identify and assess risks based on geographic context, sector, and business relationships throughout their own activities, so both at the headquarter and subsidiary levels, as well as throughout their value chain. And this should be an ongoing process, not a once-off process, as the risks to human rights may change over time. And it should also be informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. I just want to really quickly touch on saliency, because I think it's extremely important, because the UNGPs acknowledge that it's not always possible for a business to address all of its adverse human rights impacts simultaneously, and therefore businesses should prioritize actions to address those impacts that are most severe. And this should be determined based on scale, being the gravity of the impact, scope being the number of individuals that will or potentially are affected, and irremediability being any limits on the ability to restore those affected to a situation at least the same as the situation they were in before. And as a very final point, I just wanted to note that in line with the UNGPs, human rights due diligence should always be complemented by appropriate policies, setting out the commitment of a business to respect human rights and efforts to embed human rights due diligence across a business's various levels and functions, as well as active engagement in the remediation of adverse impacts caused or contributed to by the business. So I'll hand back over to you, Rishi, but also welcome attendees to ask any questions.
Thank you, Samishta. That's awesome. Certainly there are a lot of distinctions of the UNGPs and the human rights due diligence process. Thanks for touching on knowing and showing. Thanks for touching upon scale and scope, which is a very big distinction of the due diligence process. And also about, I would add from my side, cause, contribute, linked. Their business responsibility is in different levels in the UNGP. It's a very big distinction, I think, when we use the guiding principles. I would continue to request our participants, a lot of friends have joined in, 43 people we have right now in the session, to put in your comments and any questions in the Q&A section. We certainly can attempt to, put the nuts and bolts, but there's much more to this subject. Please share your thoughts and experiences as well. So I just wanted to move to Kevin. Kevin, we've spoken a lot about, the definition of the due diligence. But why is it so important to businesses, and why the subject keeps on coming in discussion when we're talking to businesses?
Sure. So, thank you, Rishi. I think to answer your question on why human rights due diligence comes in discussion so often, it's basically the following reason. After the UN guiding principles were endorsed by the UN in 2011, the EU and then eventually the UN Working Group on Business Human Rights recommended countries to develop national action plans on business and human rights. Now, NAP set out the policy priorities of states in addressing business and human rights issues. And since NAPs should take the UNGPs as a starting point, that also means that NAPs should address human rights due diligence. So how does the state implement, legislate for human rights due diligence, ideally? So what we have seen is that certain countries have already started to introduce mandatory human rights legislation. Now, generally, mandatory HRDD means laws that can be enforced on companies. So, for example, this could be enforced by states on companies through criminal and administrative law, and or it could be enforced by victims on companies through private law, like through tort law. So if victims have damages, they can enforce it on the companies through the courts. Now, examples of countries with human rights due diligence legislation are France and the Netherlands. There are, of course, ongoing developments. Germany recently has announced that they will create such a law too. And maybe most importantly for our discussion here is that the EU is working on what seems a very ambitious human rights due diligence law with a wide scope of application. Now, in essence, European companies will be required to conduct human rights due diligence throughout their supply chain and operations throughout the world. And this will, of course, have a significant impact in South Asia and other parts of the world. For South Asia, for example, many of the European supply chains, they start here. Think about the materials, the cotton, think about the textile and garment factories. Because European companies will require this of suppliers, these suppliers will be required to cooperate in and or conduct human rights due diligence themselves. As to why this is relevant for companies, maybe someone else can answer that. I'm not sure what you were thinking, Rishi.
Thanks, Kevin. Very important points. I could say from an Indian context, being an Indian, certainly we are the factory and the farm of the world. We aspire to be the supply base of the world, and certainly there's a long way to go. And I feel those movements in Europe are going to impact businesses in India. Also on the sourcing side, as well as some of the subsidiaries of European companies which are operating in India. So, I think there's a lot of movement happening there, and human rights due diligence is becoming the talk of the town, isn't it? There's so much to learn from there. Samishta, what about you? Why do you think businesses should care about the due diligence process?
Sure, thanks very much, Rishi. I think a good way to think about why human rights due diligence is important to business is to think about the consequences of failing to carry it out or failing to carry it out sufficiently. So it can risk investor divestment, can risk negative publicity, financial and reputational damage to a company, and in some cases also legal action. And we've seen that there's increasing momentum and pressure on business to understand, manage and report on human rights risks. So growing momentum around mandatory human rights due diligence, which Kevin mentioned, alongside other human rights reporting developments, including modern slavery legislation, placing expectations on companies relating to human rights risk management and reporting. We've also seen heightened expectations from business partners on human rights risk management, with the potential for competitive advantage for companies that can know and show that they're managing their risks effectively and therefore respecting human rights. There's also significant developments in investor expectations around the implementation of key business and human rights standards, including human rights due diligence. And this has been really highlighted through both benchmarking and shareholder activism. So last year, 176 institutional investors representing, I think, over $4.5 trillion in assets under management came together to urge 95 large companies that scored 0 on human rights due diligence in the corporate human rights benchmark to take fast and concrete steps to address their poor performance in this area. And additionally, investors are increasingly showing up at annual general meetings of businesses to request more robust human rights due diligence, basing their arguments on risks to the company if this is not done properly. And one of the final things I wanted to bring up was also the increasing focus of civil society organisations and unions on human rights globally. And we've seen that this is really growing, not declining, with increased concerns around respect for human rights as part of the COVID-19 response and growing scrutiny on businesses to really walk the talk. And I think it's important to remember that doing human rights due diligence well should allow a company to pursue new opportunities, as it should really help rather than hinder it to operate in different geographies, transactions, and situations in a way that respects rights.
Thank you both, Kevin and Shamishta. You brought out the importance of the due diligence process. I think it's very clear, written on the wall, that it certainly enhances the way of doing business. There are many drivers you noted, so thanks for that. My ongoing request to the participants, please put your comments and questions so we can answer them. We will have a question break very soon, so I can bring in some of your, even if you have a comment, you can put it on the Q&A box, or if there's anything you would ask our panelists to really focus upon. I want to shift attention to Daniel, and Daniel, you've done some work in conflict regions. You look at the due diligence process. It's a very different area than what we look into, mostly factories and farms. How does it look like from your viewpoint, Daniel, the due diligence process?
Thank you very much, Rashid. Thank you, Shamishta and Kevin, for the really comprehensive overview of what human rights due diligence is. Rishi, I would point out, though, there are factories and farms in conflict-affected areas, right? And in fact, what I want to talk a little bit about is conflict-affected areas doesn't just mean that there's a war going on. I mean, it's anywhere where there is instability, inequalities, and issues that would give rise to conflict in the future. So we're talking about human rights due diligence. We're talking about preventing abuses. And I'd add that that's kind of why companies should be interested in human rights due diligence, not just because of reputations, et cetera, but because companies are not real things. They are legal. It's a legal fiction that covers the actions of people, and people should not want human rights abuses to occur. They shouldn't want to contribute to be complicit in any way. And so I always am quite amazed by this. I was in a workshop with a group of human rights due diligence experts and companies a couple of years ago, and it was only after an hour, we were discussing modern slavery. It was only after an hour that I realized we're talking about the risks here, and we're talking about two different things. The companies are talking about risks to their reputation of being caught up in a modern slavery scandal, but the real risk is that there will be slaves. There will be people's rights abuses. So it was quite an eye-opener for everybody in the room when we suddenly realized we're talking about two different sets of risks here. I think this becomes even more stark when we start talking about conflict-affected areas. And in a conflict-affected area, companies need to understand that they are not neutral. They have an impact on both human rights and the conflict or potential conflict. And the human rights due diligence process is based on proportionality. The more risk there is, the more that is required from the business. And this really comprehensive and ambitious human rights due diligence framework that's just been explained very well is even more complicated in a conflict-affected area. You are expected to do more. Companies are expected to not only look at their impact on human rights, but also their impact on the conflict itself. And this is much a more complicated and difficult process. Now, it's a tall order because we know very few companies actually do a human rights due diligence process as outlined by Shamistha just before. So how can we then expect them to actually then add on yet another ongoing important process of conflict sensitivity? It's really, really a big ask. But the results, if it doesn't happen, are clear. You just need to look to your neighbors in Southeast Asia to see what happens when there is not an impact assessment on conflict done when large-scale investment happens. And this is not just where there is a conflict ongoing. Companies are expected to look at the triggers and indicators, to look at beyond conflict, where there are weak states and weak institutions, where there's a record of human rights violations and all the warning signals that give rise to conflicts, like widespread condonance of hate speech or discrimination, mass inequalities, or where a lot of different minority groups live together in close quarters and there are issues of discrimination. Conflict sensitivity means looking beyond just the impact on human rights. A company can follow all its human rights obligations and still contribute to a conflict. A perfect example is hiring a security force that behaves very well, but the security force is one ethnic group and the other ethnic group doesn't like the fact that they're getting hired. The company hasn't broken any human rights laws, but it is contributing to the underlying factors in the conflict. So there's a whole other level that needs to be involved here, and it involves consultation with civil society, armed non-state actors, militaries, and a huge amount of expertise additional to the usual human rights due diligence process.
Thank you, Daniel, for your sharing, and enlightening us on issues of conflict. My own personal understanding is limited, so I'm learning as you're speaking, and it's a subject I would like to learn more about. And so especially, when something is happening in our neighborhood, there's more curiosity to learn more. We have some wonderful questions coming up as well, and I just want to give a chance to pick up those questions and to see if we can answer them. Thank you, participants, for putting those questions. We will try our best to answer them. And if you're not able to, maybe we'll develop a Q&A document and send it across to all the participants here today. So the first question is about, what happens when a company is doing due diligence, but there are still legal violations which happen. And so the question is about what is the company's legal liability when it's doing the due diligence process. I just want to pass it on to Shamistha and Kevin, if you had any comments on this question. Couple of minutes, please.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in first, and then Kevin, please jump in as well. I think conducting appropriate human rights due diligence should really help businesses address the risk to legal claims against them by knowing and showing that they've taken every reasonable step to avoid involvement in an alleged human rights abuse. However, the UNGPs are quite clear that businesses conducting such due diligence should not assume that conducting it in and of itself will automatically and fully absolve them from liability of causing or contributing to human rights abuses. So human rights due diligence is very much so a process of continuous improvement. As I said at the start, it's not a one-off activity that must be undertaken. It's critical that it is carried out as an iterative process, as situations can change so rapidly, and we've definitely seen that with COVID. So I think it does help in removing some of the risk of liability, but it goes to that second part of the question on what is proper human rights due diligence. And I think it is going very much so back to that process of not just identifying and assessing your human rights risks, but taking action to address them directly. So, and whether that's in your activities or in your supply chain. And I think that's where we often find this disconnect is companies go to identifying and assessing, but they're not taking action to address them and then tracking that to make sure that it's effective. So I think I will leave it there and give Kevin a chance to also respond.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Shamishta. I think you outlined perfectly what is expected from the UNGPs. And I just wanted to add on that, it's maybe a general a comment. There are, of course, more comments, but then it gets really technical about specific laws in specific countries. But of course, once these laws are introduced, it would kind of depend how these laws are drafted, right? So ideally, they would follow the UN guiding principles. But then also, of course, there's questions about, like Shamishta said, when you conduct human rights due diligence, in what circumstances should the company be held liable? And I mean, you cannot really make a lot of general comments because it will also depend on the law of the country and what type of enforcement model is used, right? So if you use criminal law, you might have to look at the national law, like how liability is assigned to companies, similar with administrative law. And then again, with tort law, it really depends. Like, first of all, do you have a common law system, a civil law system? So yeah, I just want to leave it there that if you are interested in this, there's really a lot of writing on this. And this is really actually also a conversation that is still in full swing in many countries and as well in the EU. So thank you.
Thank you, Shamishta. Thank you, Kevin. I would like to take the next question, which is about how do we evaluate human rights due diligence without corporate human rights policy and commitment? So if a company does not have a policy and commitment, how will we evaluate due diligence in those cases? Just wanted to pass it over to Daniel. Daniel, would you like to answer this question?
Well, I think you have a very difficult time doing that. I mean, the first step is really to have that kind of policy. And I think this is where the human rights due diligence programs break down is where you're dealing with companies that aren't engaged in this process at all. And you're dealing with states that don't have any regulations in this area at all. And I wonder sometimes, and I'll ask the audience, well, what is the point where businesses say, we can't conduct human rights due diligence because of whatever the different obstacles that are in the way? Is there a point where they say it is impossible to conduct human rights due diligence in line with the United Nations guiding principles in this situation, in which case we won't invest here?
Thank you, Daniel. I hope our participants could also comment on the inquiry you are making. Just want to go to the next question, which is about what is the role of buying companies in terms of helping suppliers mitigate human rights risk? Excellent question. Is a question which comes out quite often when we look at supply chains. Shamishta, would you like to go for that question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rishi. I think buyer companies have a huge role that they can play in helping suppliers to mitigate human rights abuses. I think often starts with the supplier code of conduct, which sets out the human rights standards that suppliers should adhere to, but then it goes much further than that because there is such a power imbalance between buying companies and suppliers. Companies need to go beyond putting in place a supplier conduct to capacity building with suppliers, providing them with training and resources to support their workers and awareness raising. So I think there is such a huge role that buying companies can play. And I think that that should definitely be tailored depending on the supplier as well that they're working with. Suppliers operate in such different contexts and also have such different resources available to them, and different understandings of human rights in practice and what that means. So it's really important for buying companies to work with suppliers to understand what their needs are, and then to support them in fulfilling the human rights requirements that are imposed on them.
Thank you, Samishta. Having spent myself, 2 decades in the supply chain space, I believe there's a much bigger need of collaboration within the supply chain, with large players hand-holding the smaller ones. I think COVID-19 did expose that need quite clearly. So thanks a lot for sharing that. I have a few comments. I'll just touch upon those comments, and then we'll go to the next section. We have some very good comments coming up on the importance of stakeholder dialogue and engagement. It is the constant process in which we are able to understand risks to right holders by talking to them. We also had, as an inquiry, could we bring in other processes together, something like a social audit? I would think our colleagues also talking about social dialogue. How can we bring these things together, some existing processes, into the due diligence framework? And an excellent point, talks about developing micro models at the workplace level and at the community level. Excellent point. And also about the combination of these things. So I just want to go to the next level. Thank you so much for people who are already commenting and putting your questions. Please continue doing that. Like I said, I will take some breaks in between to answer your questions and also take in your comments. So thank you so much for those comments. I want to move to the second part of our discussion, and that is about realities on the ground. What really happens on the ground, and let's take a snapshot of that and discuss it further. I'm just going to share a video with you on screen, and then I would request Sandeep to share his life journey. Sandeep, you had an interesting life journey, also your experiences on the realities on the ground. So
Rishi, can you wait for the video till I keep it up?
Please go ahead, Sandeep. And I would request other participants, right? We all are learners using this technology. So, bear with us if something does not go seamlessly. Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you, Rishi, and thank you, Shamishta and Kevin. I learned a lot about the process you're talking about today. And Daniel, you spoke from heart too, that corporates have to look at it more than just a business risk. Rishi, you asked me to speak about reality on the ground. I'll do it in 2 ways. First, I'll try giving a view from the bottom, which is informed by about 2,700 injured workers that we have helped over the last 3-4 years, and their precarious working conditions and their invisibility to large businesses and frankly to a lot of people like us. And secondly, I'll try a view from the top, which is about seeing the policy framework that is being put by some of the top corporates in India for their deeper supply chains. Again, these supply chains which are invisible, workers are non-unionized, very limited access to redressal, things that all the 3 panelists spoke about before me. And these insights are in a much larger context, of course, for people who are not from India, especially, we have a country of 1.2 billion people, of which 450 million are migrants. Of those 450 million, 10 million are interstate migrants. Of those 10 million interstate migrants, 65% work in manufacturing sector. So now in Safe in India, we work with this manufacturing sector in Gurgaon, Faridabad, which are one of the largest auto sector manufacturing hubs in the country. These 2 locations are replete with small villages and worker colonies with more than probably 1 million workers. And these are the workers we are talking about. And the working conditions and the living conditions of these workers, we also believe, like has been said before just now, they're linked to productivity. And we have to remember that India's labor productivity is 115th in the world. So we keep stressing the point that we are not just talking of human rights. We are talking of a business opportunity here. We have to work both from heart and mind. So now in that context, the data that I'm going to share is from 2,700 workers who we have assisted, so we know them. It's not a survey or a poll. We have helped them get about $2 million worth of compensation and helped them with healthcare after accident. And this is what they tell us. 70% of them have lost their hands and or fingers. So more than 2,500 people that we know of, a small team of us. 88% are migrants. 65% were on contracts. More than half of them, when they had their accident, were below 30 years of age. And hardly anyone we know is part of any union. Shamishta talked about saliency. I think there is a case for that. Now, what do these workers that I've just described tell us about their work environment, about their injuries? 80% of them work in auto component factories. Now, clearly you are focused in those areas, so we will get more auto component factories, but 80% of crush injuries to these workers are happening in these factories because of metal forming machines. A quarter of these are in direct tier 1 suppliers of the large brands. The remaining 75% odd are in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, deeper supply chain, and that's where we know things get worse as we go down. 70% of them say that the accidents happen because of excessive production pressure. So this is about unreasonable working conditions. Almost half of them say that they work 6 days a week, not a surprise, but 12 hours a day all those 6 weeks, and they do not get paid for extra, for overtime, which clearly means not enough nutrition and all the other factors that we talk about that contribute to these conditions. 80% of these machines where these accidents happen did not have safety mechanisms on them, like safety sensors, and these are required as per regulations. So we're talking human rights, we're also talking, rules and regulations which should be adhered to in any case. During COVID-19 lockdown, where we served about 500,000 meals to people in these areas, when a quarter of them had left for their hometowns, home villages, the month of March, when the lockdown happened, in April, 25 or 30% of them were not paid even their March salaries. By May, 70% were not paid their April salaries. So, this keeps coming out as a bigger and bigger systemic issue which contributes to these problems. And we can talk about all sorts of violations under articles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's the evidence for that. But let me not just keep talking about them as workers. Let's actually get them in this room. And if I could now request you, Rishi, to play that video. If it doesn't play, we'll carry on. And let's try it.
Thank you. Let me give it a try.
Thank you.
Is the screen visible?
Yes.
Got that.
ऑडिट वाले आएंगे अपने ऑफिस में आके खाना खाया पिया और अपने चले गए। शाम को उनकी दावत होगी पार्टी के, ये कंपनी वाला पार्टी देगा उनको, शाम को खा पी के चले जाएंगे। उनका शॉप से कोई मतलब नहीं है क्या हो रहा है क्या नहीं हो रहा है। ऐसा कितने लोग मानते हैं? जैसे आज ऑडिट है, उनको रोक दिया जाता है। रोक इसलिए दिया जाता है कि अगर वो देखेंगे कि हमारा अंगूठा कटा है तो वो लोग माल नहीं लेंगे। अगर सीनियर उनके आते हैं तो बाकी, जहाँ तक मेरा अंदाज है, सीनियर तो उनके नहीं है। जैसे बोले कुछ लोग बोले जापानी आते हैं, जापानी ने किसी को देखा है? कोई नहीं देखा है। सारे बीज कंपनी वाले आते हैं। ये इसलिए होता है, वो आते हैं खाते हैं पीते हैं, इसलिए चले जाते हैं कि उनको पैसे मिल जाते हैं। इसलिए हमने आपको पहले भी अगले मीटिंग में आपको बताया था इस बात को। वो आते हैं पैसे लेते हैं चले जाते हैं ना। उनसे ये चेक करने से मोबाइल हमारी सही है कि गलत है, उनको बस आए खाए पी चले गए। माल सही बन रहा है कि सही नहीं बन रहा है, उनको सही माल से मतलब है, चाहे आपका हाथ कटे या खुद कट जाओ। तो वो लोग आते हैं तो वो तो हटा देते हैं, अपने लोग बैठ जाते हैं भरकर। पूरी किसी को जानकारी ही नहीं है। 8 दिन तक की मेरी सन 2012 में उंगली कटी थी मुझे। 1 महीना हुआ था करते करते। मैं तो गया था चलाने के लिए। जब किसी वर्कर को भर्ती करने से पहले उसे बताया ही नहीं जाता है जिस कंपनी में कि मतलब कैसे काम करना है, किस तरीके से क्या क्या करना है। अब वहाँ तो ऐसा हो रहा है, चल ये आ गया, चल भाई ये काम ऐसे करना है, ये दबानी है, ये मारना है, ये हटाना है, ये चल रहा है कंपनियों के अंदर। अब यहाँ बोल रहे ऑडिट वाले हीरो वाले आते हैं, मारुति वाले। यहाँ पे फुल वर्कर ऐसे बैठे हुए हैं जिन्हें यही नहीं पता ये हीरो कंपनी वाले या मारुति वाले से आए कि आज ऑडिट है या नहीं है। बस अगर आए हैं थोड़ी देर के लिए, हेलमेट दे दिया, वो लगा लो, ग्लव्स पहन लो, ये लगा के चलाने लगो थोड़ी देर के लिए, वो चले गए। बस फिर मर्जी चाहो पैसा करो, धक्के मार के काम करवाओ। ये होता है कंपनियों, जो मेरे हिसाब से हो रहा मेरे कंपनी के अंदर।
Sandeep just saw the video. I just want to take 30 seconds while the video was being played. There are some people in the list who know that my career started working in an auto component factory. Coincidentally, I still have my glove with me, which I used to wear. I keep it in my bag every day. I took it out while we were looking at this video, very close to my heart. Go ahead, Sandeep.
Thank you, Rishi. That played perfectly. So this is the view we wanted to share from the bottom. This is the workers' view. This is what they tell us. Now I want to move to the second part, which is view from the top. And there are a couple of things. Number one, it is our core belief, as the panelists have said before us, that the responsibility for correcting this, we believe, lies with the business. And that too, primarily with the brand owners. Secondly, supply chains over decades have been created for a reason. They provide flexibility, they provide cost advantages, often because there is a compromise on either human rights or environment. And it is time to change that, right? We heard about conflict. Are we building towards a conflict is a thing that should really worry us. So what is it that we expect from the top? These are the brand owners who have the resources. These are the brand owners who have the power. These are the brand owners who actually have the most influence over government policies and the quality of implementation of these policies. They indeed will see the most benefit of any improvements and corrections that are done. They have the most capital. They have the expertise to solve this problem. All reasons for them to be able to take a lead. In fact, we did a poll last year and more than 130 respondents said, more than 80% of 130 respondents said that it should be the business which is primarily responsible for correcting this as opposed to the government. So what we have done therefore, because 80% of these accidents that we have are from auto sector supply chain, is we started engaging with the auto sector brands, first the large 3 in North India, now 10 across the country. And we're really happy that 6 of them are engaging with us. And we have actually started building on some action points with them. What we did, Chitra and I, Chitra is the head of safety, over the last 4 or 5 months is we looked at the OSH policies, occupational safety and health policies of these top 10 brands as we could see them in their publicly declared documents. The kind of documents which have been discussed earlier, human rights policies, codes of conduct, business responsibility reports, which are meant to go to stock exchanges in India, sustainability reports, suppliers code of conduct, financial reports, integrated reports, all this stuff, right? And we looked at from the lens of OSH, because that clearly is a large lens for looking at human rights issue, and because we deal with that issue. And we looked at it from the point of view of deeper supply chain. And what we found from these 10, and because 6 have engaged with us, we are pretty sure of our findings. We will publish this report in the next few weeks, but just a couple of highlights. The OSH policies are adequate for their own premises and their factories, it appears to be so, right? So that is good, and we don't have evidence of accidents and such problems within their factories, except that even their own policies are not as good for their own contract workers as they are for their own permanent workers. And in today's world, even in the large brands, 50 to 70% of workers in the factories are contract workers. So that's the first thing that needs repairing. Second, we found that in the deeper supply chain, for them, the OSH policies are inadequate, in fact, mostly non-existent. Where they do have some policies, there isn't enough evidence for action or implementation. 3 out of 10, thankfully, do have supplier code of conduct, which was mentioned earlier, right? And this must be replicated across the industry. But none of them have a fully articulated human rights policy in public domain. They may have it in private, we don't know of that. One of them actually has come forward and told us they'll be rolling it out, so we are thankful for that. Practically non-existent reporting against the SDG indicator 8.8, which is about safe and secure working environment. Now that's something one would expect from all the listed companies of today, right? But we must also give credit where it is due. So one of them has acknowledged now the presence of tier 2, 3, 4 as part of their suppliers in their policies. That is a big step, because most companies do not define suppliers as deep supply chain. It's at best direct suppliers, right? This same company is reporting on tier 2 audits now after our discussions. Another company promotes sustainability in their supply chain. It's a start. Another company has a charter of contract workers, the only one out of 10 with a charter of contract workers. And one has a supplier of conduct which includes OSH. So you see, there is patchy good stuff, but it all needs to come together. We have a start. And therefore, these violations are not happening in a vacuum. These violations are happening in an environment where the policy framework of the large brands is inadequate for their supply chains, especially, right? This is not going to be just a CSR activity. This has to be part of core operations if this has to be corrected. And self-certification, which is often being promoted, is actually not going to serve the purpose, we believe. This has to be a robust due diligence process started by, promoted by, pushed by the brand owners themselves. We believe it should be industry-wide, potentially independently done, with some kind of collaborative or participatory model, hopefully between industry and the workers, to really address the structural issues. It has to be out the word and the spirit. It cannot be a tick box exercise. Without that, we are not going to find the structural solutions. The structural solutions to structural deficiencies, which are natural to some of these communities and environments, but some of them have been created as part of the business. And you know, I take some inspiration from some of the brand owners who have been working with us and the steps that they are agreeing with us. Same thing about state government, same thing about central government. We have agreed a number of actions. We're hoping that will follow. Also, because there is another project going on in India called Social Compact, which is promoted by companies like Thermax, Forbes, Godrej, better companies of the lot. And they, along with some of our partners like Ajivika Bureau and others, and Dasra, have started putting this compact in place, social compact in place, which is about first their own workers in their premises, and then going down to improve the working conditions. So there is definitely a move in the right direction, but a long way to go. And today's discussion is helping me think better, and I hope I have given some food for thought. Thanks, Rishi.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks for your strong comments and sharing these, real examples from the ground. Like I said, very close to my heart because my career started in the kind of factories you mentioned, and that has led to the journey of the human rights due diligence as I'm presenting today. We're getting some comments and thoughts in the chat box. I would also request participants to put some comments and thoughts if they would have in the Q&A section. And I would just want to move to our neighboring country, Bangladesh, and to see what's happening there. I have dear friend Martin joining us from there, from the garment and apparel industry. Martin Bhai, welcome to our group. From your viewpoint, Martin Bhai, what works, what doesn't work when it comes to worker engagement? You're managing thousands of workers. COVID happened. Garment industry itself, there's a lot happens in that sector. Give us some insights of your work and your life, Martin.
Thanks, Rishi. Good afternoon, everybody. Rishi, as you know that I am from a military background, so I want to start this session or my speech with a commonly saying words in the military. That is, for a single nail, a horseshoe was lost. For a horseshoe, one horse was lost. And for that horse, one message was lost. And only for that message, a battle was lost. Once I've joined in this factory or in this environment, I found that that nail is nothing but the mutual trust amongst the entrepreneur and the workers. You will find that the workers are not believing what the entrepreneurs are saying. The entrepreneurs are not believing what the workers are saying. That is the main gray area in HR due diligence, what I feel. So to have a mutual trust amongst these two parties, you have to bring both of them in a table. Once they will have a talk across the table, many of the problems can be solved. In my factory, we are almost 9,000 plus workers are working, and we are having a elected trade union where we have already signed 2 collective bargaining agreements with the trade union, and we are working very in a cozy and in a comfortable condition. The main thumb rule of this success is that once I am talking with my workers or with my workers leaders, as if I am transparent to them, they will understand what are the problems I am facing. And once they are transparent with us, we also can understand what are the problems the workers are facing in their floor, in their daily life, and in their with their allied facilities. So if you have a regular communication with your workers through the social dialogue, then many of the problems can be solved very easily. Very easily. In my factory during this COVID or before the COVID and after the COVID, one thing we used to have regular social dialogue with our trade union people, and we try to find out that what are the improvements can be done to ensure their human rights. If they are having some violation of the human rights in any of the floor, that things can be addressed within a very short period of time, and we can take the remedial measures so that these things never happens in the business. But now come to the other point, that is, once you are having freedom of association in your factory, you are going to face some of the problem in your business, because business means you are going to invest something and you are looking for the return. If you don't have the return, then you are not going to invest anything. These workers are some sort of investment for the investors also, and every investor wants that his workers are in a healthy condition and they give their maximum for the factory. Now things is that as per the government law of Bangladesh, we are supposed to increase the salary of our workers every year 5%. But once I am having a trade union, I had a collective bargaining issue with the trade union and I had to make it 7%. So once I am increasing $1 salary, it at the end of the year, a factory like me has to pay $0.25 million per year. That is I have to, the total expenditure increased by this way. Now, from where this money will come? Because the factories, those are having the freedom of, they are having the trade union, and the factories, those are not having the trade union, they are not facing the same thing. But having trade union, having workers with you, but you don't have any incentive from any corner, neither from the buyer corners nor from the government corners. We are talking about the human rights, and if you think about the human rights, then you must allow the freedom of association. Once you have the freedom of association, then many things can be negotiated. The workers will have their representative who can bargain with the management people, with the owners, and they can reflect the actual problems of the workers. But factories doesn't have the freedom of organization. They can bypass many things. A factory doesn't have the freedom of association, he can increase the salary by 5% every year. I am giving 7%. Now this additional 2% cost, who is going to bear it? So the factories, those who all are having these sort of facilities for the workers, that might be addressed. And beside this, till now, we are always trying to reflect the negative newses and negative things in the media and other places, but we never bring out the success stories of the factories or in the industry. If we have these success stories in the medias and in the other national and international forums, then other will be interested to move with those factories, those who are having the success stories. These success stories must be published, must be brought on media and other places, so others are also interested to have these things. The time has passed. Earlier, we had a lot of limitations. We have a mindset that the freedom of association and the human rights issues will create only the expenditure and other things, and it will not have any dividend or any return. But nowadays, things are not like that. If you can make your people understand, that yes, with the rights, you must have some responsibility for the organization. So rights and responsibilities, if both can be understood to your workers or to your people, then they can bring dividend for the industry or for the organization. But yes, it is our drawbacks also. We always try to make the people or make the workers understand what is their rights. But with the rights, if you can learn, you can teach them, you can make them understand, yes, with your rights, you are also have some responsibilities and you have to go through or abide all those responsibilities. In that case, it will be a boosting element for you and for your organization, both. So this is how we are working now in Bangladesh. Yes, this COVID was a huge jerk for us, especially economically. The factory was closed for more than 1 month, and after that again we have started working, but with a limited time span and making a shift of 2 shift, having 7 hours working hours per day. Now we are pulling, but I don't know that how long it will be. God forbids that if the things goes worse, then it might happen anything. But till now, working with the people, feeling the pulse of your workers is very important to have a human rights due diligence in a positive way. This is, I want to have a pause here.
Thank you, Martin Bhai, for sharing your experience and the realities on the ground. I also shared with a session yesterday about, we do have a figure for what will it take for climate change. For example, some trillions of dollars, some figure has arrived. Businesses will have to pay, but we've never arrived at a figure where we have to, how much will it cost the whole industry to look at better dignity and respect of the people who work in the various sectors. A linked question also and thought came in about the smaller players, etc., which I'll take up in the question break, which will happen very soon. But I wanted to just shift gears and come to the main point of our session today. What is human rights due diligence not? And in underscore highlight not. So there are a lot of misconceptions and barriers around human rights due diligence. Some of you have brought all those barriers and misconceptions, and some have come in the chat through questions and comments. I would also request our participants to add to those misconceptions, which we will share now, from their viewpoint, their experience, and their area of work. I wanted to open it up to Samishta, Kevin, and Daniel. Please take a couple of minutes. What are the misconceptions around human rights due diligence, or maybe any barriers? It's the theme of our session today. What do you think are these still floating misconceptions? Samishta, you first, then Kevin, and then Daniel.
Sure, thank you very much, Rishi. And I think from the work that I do at Pillar 2 with companies, we often see that human rights due diligence is not understood properly. And this results in a variety of different things, including really big one is the misconstruction of risk. And this is something that actually came up at the poll at the start. So we see companies operating with the mindset of risk to business rather than risk to people. So not focusing on impacts on workers, communities, and consumers, and therefore not addressing those impacts on people. One thing I touched on earlier as well was this failure to conduct human rights due diligence on an ongoing basis is something that we see as a big gap. And a couple of other things. One is there's also a failure to address the most significant or the most severe risks to human rights first. And companies tend to focus on those risks that are either easy to address or where there is negative criticism or publicity around specific risks, rather than looking at what are the systemic risks, which often take a lot more work to address, but are very important to address to ensure that you are embedding human rights throughout the organization. And then something else I wanted to mention is that companies also tend to focus on, they tend not to focus on their entire range of business relationships. So companies can't ignore what's happening in their own activities and firstly just look at suppliers. And likewise, they can't just look at suppliers and then not look at other business partners such as joint venture partners or acquisition partners. And the final one that I would mention before I hand over to Kevin is another gap that we often see relates to current supply chain management. So human rights due diligence tends to be focused on tier 1 suppliers and doesn't tend to extend throughout the value chain. And that's really critical to see that contractual relationships with tier 1 suppliers require those suppliers to cascade human rights requirements down the supply chain so that companies can really build that culture of respecting human rights, not just in their own activities, but across their entire value chain. So Kevin, I'll hand over to you to add to that.
Thank you, Shamishta. Just want to touch upon, the aspect about the continual nature of the due diligence cycle. It's not a one-time activity. It's not about getting it right by the book. It's about learning from mistakes. It's about, improving our process, and most importantly, making an impact, a positive impact in the lives of the rights holders. Thank you, Shamishta, for adding that. Kevin, over to you.
Sure, thank you, Rishi and Shamishta, and everyone else who came before, actually, because you touched on a lot of issues that I actually want to address. And my first misconception actually relates to the question posed by Dr. Rajesh Gopal. And the first major flaw is that companies confuse social audits with human rights due diligence. Now, my point is the following. Human rights due diligence can include social audits, but human rights due diligence is so much more. Now, HRDD requires you to know what happens in your supply chain. However, some companies send an auditor to a factory once a year. So then they have no clue really what happens in that factory. Second, it is a known problem that many audits are announced to factories beforehand, right? Otherwise, they may not let you in. So some factory owners will clean up the factory, hide dangerous parts, and train and force workers to answer questions in certain ways, like you saw in the video, which was showed before. So we need much more than one-off auditing, like Shamishta said. It's simply not human rights due diligence. Third, and related to this, sometimes companies use big centralized auditing platforms and certification schemes. So where you basically have a big database with audit results. Again, just using a database is not really conducting human rights due diligence, because you yourself, you have no idea what is happening in the factories that are being audited. You don't really know the auditor well, and you have no idea about the on-the-ground realities. You just read reports behind your computer screen, likely in another country, usually at the headquarters of a big company. So while these platforms can be a part of a company's human rights due diligence process, it cannot be the only thing. So just to be very clear here, I'm not saying that these initiatives are not good. They are great, and I really like them. However, I'm just saying that human rights due diligence, you need to do more. You need to step beyond that, and you need to be actively involved yourself. Now, a fourth misconception, and a well-known problem actually, is that auditors are overworked and underpaid, right? So there's a real risk that they are bribed by factory owners or consultants. So you really need auditors that you trust, ideally your own people. Fifth, and connected to this, companies conducting human rights due diligence often say that auditors are independent. Now, I want to be really clear about this. Everyone should realize that this is usually nonsense. Note that there are some exceptions, which we can get into later, but generally, a company pays an auditor. So if you pay someone, they are not independent. This is a classic conflict of interest situation in corporate governance and the financial and auditing and reporting industry and other consulting services. So I'll leave this one for now, but just to say, if a company pays auditors, the auditor will listen to the company, not the rights holders.
Kevin, that's awesome. Thanks for packing it up.
So I have 3 more points, if you don't mind. So very fast. First, these are very important, actually. HRDD should not only be outward looking, but also inward looking. For example, they shouldn't look at how suppliers address human rights issues. Companies should also consider how their own actions affect human rights conditions at suppliers. For example, take purchasing practices. If I don't pay enough money to suppliers, then how can the workers ever earn a living wage? If I set too strict time deadlines, suppliers might force workers to work excessive overtime. So HRDD should always be inward looking. And now just one more point. HRDD should be both conducted upstream and downstream. So downstream into your suppliers, but upstream also to your consumers. You should think like, what human rights impacts will my products or services have on consumers? And human rights due diligence should not be conducted in a silo. they shouldn't look strictly at just human rights outlined in treaties, but also at broader impacts such as corruption, bribery, climate change and environment, conflict, and so on. And so these things actually in a company should also be addressed within the same departments. It should be integrated. You shouldn't have your anti-corruption stuff in a legal department and then your human rights issues in a sustainability or CSR department. Sorry for going a little bit of overtime there. Back to you, Rishi.
That's awesome, Kevin. You bring, pack in a lot of points. All of them are important. I like the idea about, outwards and inwards, doing both, the upstream, the downstream, the pulse check, doing it the right way. And you brought out some points about auditors, about the integrated nature of it, the fabric part of looking at human rights in the value chain. Thanks a ton, Kevin. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks again. A lot of the important points have been touched upon, but I think there's a fundamental problem with the name human rights due diligence, because it's not due diligence. It's the role of lawyers within this process, us. There's a problem. When lawyers look at due diligence, we think about what risks are there to the company and how do we limit our liabilities by doing this? And human rights due diligence is in fact the opposite of that. You are supposed to engage with and accept a responsibility for a much broader range of issues that could arise normally. And to a lawyer working for a company, this is a bit terrifying. We're worried that we might be accepting a legal duty of care by engaging with these different groups, that we might be accepting that we are acknowledging our responsibilities if something goes wrong. It's in our interest to consult in a narrower focus, because we don't want to engage with those risky elements, right? Because that opens up liability. And the danger of a human rights due diligence process is that now no company can say we have no duty of care, right? It's sort of accepted that you have duty of care for the supply chain and even this broader concept of stakeholders. But the problem of human rights due diligence is it can become, a lawyer can see this and say, here is a checklist of things I can do that avoids liability, right? And so I can fulfill my standard of care here, right? That will reduce our liabilities. And the points that Kevin and Shamista brought up, that it becomes a one-off, before we invest, we do our human rights due diligence, the same way that a regular due diligence process goes. So this is, I think, a fundamental problem with the concept of human rights due diligence right from the beginning. We have to get away from it being that idea of avoiding the risk to the company like a due diligence process normally does. It is about going much further, opening up all kinds of unknown questions. It's about examining the root causes of problems. It's looking at the legal system of the country that we're involved in. It's looking at inequalities and injustices, engaging with all kinds of different groups that we wouldn't normally engage with to see how a company's business will impact on the wider community. And this is kind of anathema to the idea of a due diligence process where you're trying to limit liabilities. So I think that there really needs to be a rethink about that, and particularly in areas that are affected by instability, weak governance, and conflict, because now the company is operating in a place where there is not access to human rights protection mechanisms, or at least those protection mechanisms are not functioning properly. So a company then has to take on even more responsibility. I'm not sure this is the real answer, because are we asking companies to do the role of a government when the government is not doing its role? So these are big questions that I don't have the answer to, but certainly we see these problems happening all over the world. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe there's some more comments from the audience about this questions I brought up.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Kevin and Shamista as well. We're obviously getting a lot of questions. I'm certainly trying my best to read all those questions and to see if we can make use of our time to answer those questions. So what I was trying to do was to tag those questions in some categories so we can answer them properly. I would like to shoot the question to Sandeep first. Sandeep, the question is about, how can we have a better check on ground realities, whether it is through the businesses or the government, reflecting more on what happened with the crisis with workers in COVID-19 times. Suddenly everything, surfaced out. How can we do better check on the ground for realities?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just start by actually agreeing with Daniel's concern. I do believe that the way, and I'm not an expert in HRDD at all, so I've learned a lot today from what has been told today by Kevin and Shamishta. But this HRDD sounding like the whole business to me now, and it is true, of course, because it is about people, right? But I don't know, when you ask the question, what it doesn't look like. To me, HRDD did not look like the whole business before I started this session, but it's starting to sound like everything. And therefore, to Daniel's concern, I would look at HRDD if it were to come to India through NAPs or otherwise, or through buyers in EU who will force it down, kind of thing, as probably a phased process. It has to deal with the reality, for example, that Martin is talking about on the ground, of how the workers and businesses have to deal with the situation. There is an employment situation. This is a generational thing. There is a reality on the ground which needs to be dealt with economically and not completely idealistically. And I know I'm saying a few things that I shouldn't be saying, but my point is, can we think also, you as experts, of HRDD as a phased process, which with a roadmap is implemented to get to the end game that you're describing in the right time frame, right? It could be otherwise avoided by businesses exactly as Daniel is describing, right? So that's just the previous point. To your other question, Rishi, I think one of the things, and it's an obvious one, is we got to encourage the businesses, and we got to do whatever is required to be done with the government to ensure that there is adequate reporting of violations. Across the world, reporting of violations, as far as I can see, is going down, right? And if we don't measure, show, tell, all the words that have been used earlier, right? How are we going to see the real problem, do the root cause analysis, and get to any solution? Rishi, as you said, solutions earlier, right? So, for example, we find 59% of these 2,500 accidents have happened on only one kind of machine called power press. So in our mind, a lot of our organization is focused on what is the answer for safety on power press. It's a technical question, but it's also economic question, right? If you go down that path, we come to a large solution of this problem, which then expands into a better working environment in the factory. It doesn't stay only with the power press. So my short answer to your question is, we've got to improve on reporting of these violations, and their workers have a role to play, public has a role to play, the government has a role to play, and businesses obviously have a role to play. And somehow there shouldn't be so much penalty around reporting. We have to have better grievance lines. We have to have helplines where people can call and report anonymously. We've got to create those mechanisms for people to come out and say, in this day of internet, where people can post anything, why can't factory accidents and injuries be posted on internet in some anonymous way? So, and with the data can come together in some big data way and start finding hotspots for action. But who will fund that? Who will prioritize that? Unfortunately, business will not. They're not aligned to this. Will the government? Maybe in parts, some places. Is it public? Is it the fourth estate? I don't know. But I think, to me, the starting point is, can we get it out there?
Thank you, Sandeep. Thanks a ton. I will go on to the next category of question which you have brought together about SMEs, small and medium enterprises, both on the international side as buyers. There are a lot of SMEs, and also on factories and suppliers who are also SMEs. There was a comment, they don't have the capacity or the leverage, in terms of bringing any change. When we look at that, and I open it up for Kevin to respond on it, and others please pitch in as you would like to. How do we bring in the SMEs into this whole thing? And there was also a comment about the Swiss vote recently, and that went out because SMEs, did not have the confidence of looking into their supply chain, etc. And this thing comes out again and again. I like the question because it talks both on the buying side SME and the supplying side SME. Any thoughts, Kevin, and others, please pitch in to support Kevin.
Sure, thank you, Rishi. Yeah, I think on the issue of small and medium-sized enterprises, it's a really a fair concern. Like, how do companies with maybe more limited resources than big companies address these issues? So, and to respond to the question about the law, the legislative initiative that was rejected in Switzerland through a popular referendum, I would say on the one hand, it's fair. Of course, you have some companies have huge supply chains, and of course, it is an issue. Like, how are you going to address everything? However, as Shamishta said, the UNGPs say you have to prioritize. So in the end, it kind of really depends. This is my counterpoint, how the law is created. For example, the law could say that if you tried your best, basically in normal words, you are absolved from liability. So, and some would actually argue, and I leave in the middle whether it's true or not, but that all these arguments in Switzerland about why it would be bad for businesses or impossible might be some fear mongering of certain companies. So this is what they have been accused of. I would like to leave it at that.
Thank you, Kevin. Anybody else to add to that, the SME segment of it? Any thoughts?
I could just quickly add, just to complement what Kevin said. I 100% agree. It's about, as he said in simple words, doing your best and prioritizing what is most severe and salient. And I think building and exercising leverage. So really focusing on how can we build that leverage, which is not so easy, but can include requiring or setting incentives for tier one business partners to carry out human rights due diligence and cascade it throughout their own supply chains. But starting to think for SMEs to start to think about how can we, if you don't have leverage now, how can you build it?
I'll add to that, just linking to that, I agree. I think it has to come top down in terms of what we keep saying, what good looks like. I think a lot of SMEs, owners and managers don't have the capacity to think through this issue. And rightly so, they're focused on the business. Somebody needs to increase that capacity, improve that capacity. So what does a good SME look like in the context of human rights and the business benefits of it? If they see it, my personal belief is 1/3 will change. The last 1/3 may not ever, and the middle guys will go this way or that way. But we got to really showcase what good looks like. We are working with 2 factories right now, converting their poor power presses into safer power presses, and they're finding that with just 50,000 rupees a machine, they can make it much safer and more productive, and workers are happier. So maybe there is an answer here for a number of factories, SMEs.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, everyone. There was one more question before we go to the last section of our discussion. The question was about if the companies do the due diligence as we're talking about, with all the rigor and with all the depth and breadth which is required, will business ever be profitable? That's the question which has come. Before you answer it, and I just want to open it up to all of you, I want to echo what Professor Surya Deva said in the inaugural session of this forum, is that human rights does not need a business case. It's basically linked with dignity and respect of humans, and we should not get lost in finding business cases in terms of advancing human rights in the value chains. I open it up. Will business ever make profit? And Martin, you are very close to the ground. Some of you are with business. Sandeep, you've done a lot of financial work in your life. Will business ever make profit? Over to you guys.
I want to add something.
Go ahead, Martin. Take a minute. Go ahead.
Yes, business can be profitable. There are 2 types of investment. One is tangible investment, one is intangible investment. What about the money you are involving in your business, that is intangible, but the workers, those who all are working for you, that's are also an investment. So to have a better outcome or better return from the business, you have to keep these people happy because they are your main working force. Remember one thing, that no gun in this world who can owns the battle. It is the man behind the gun who helps to win the battle. So these workers are the main man who drives your business or who helps you to achieve the goal of your company, of your factory. So if you can keep them happy, if you can keep them healthy, they will must have a positive impact on your business. Thanks, Rishi.
Thank you, Martin. Bye. Anybody else wants to go for it? Kevin, yes, Kevin, and then Daniel.
Sure, thank you, Rishi. I think, of course, these are difficult questions. And I think one of the issues is it can, of course, not come only from the brands, right? I mean, consumers in the end must be willing to pay more for products that are made responsibly. Having said that, of course, governments can play a role to legislate these things, and then companies will be, for example, European companies or companies in the West or wherever, they will be required to do this. It will add to their costs, and basically they will pass on the costs to consumers as long, based on supply and demand theory, right? So just to say that it's not only a responsibility of business, but there are many things you can do about this.
Daniel, and then Sandeep, just take a minute so we can go in the next section.
Yes, thank you. If a business conducts a thorough human rights due diligence process, an ongoing process, and determines that, for example, its workers have no access to justice or a fair trial if one of their rights are abused, then what is the result of that situation? Does a company then say, we cannot do business here? Or what happens when there are no environmental pollution standards? What happens when the government is unable to fulfill its role? There's no independent judiciary, there's no balance of powers, or when a military government comes to power. The question is then, is there a point where businesses have to say, we cannot, our human rights due diligence indicates that there is a human rights violations here and we cannot do business there? Or is that completely out of the question?
Thank you, Daniel. Sandeep?
So I think the question is not just whether they'll be profitable. I agree they will be profitable despite doing a lot of this. It's about profit maximizing. Our problem today is not profit. Our problem is profit maximization. Everybody is maximizing at every cost. That will get and should get challenged. And related to that is concentration of wealth. Consumers have to bear a cost. Maybe Uber drivers in UK will be more expensive for British citizens now that Uber has lost the case versus the drivers. But in India, you have an auto sector company where the promoter owner gets paid every year 700 times the average salary of that company. Why isn't there a compromise there? So it's not just about consumers either. So I think we are opening up a huge issue here if we're going to talk about human rights, and it actually challenges the way capitalism is today.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. And that brings us to the last section, which is about solutions, which has already, I think we were quite seamlessly coming into the solution side. We've already spoken about solutions. We're also short of time, so I'm going to do this thing a little creatively. We have around 41 participants here, and why don't we list down or think about solutions together? You know, I would obviously give 1 minute each to our panelists to bring out one important solution they have in mind, one important solution. And can I also request our participants who are there, can you type one important solution in your mind in the Q&A section? It could be very simple and it could be more detailed, but one solution you have in mind. So I would request all our 41 participants to be part of the solution. You know, we have to be all part of the solution. Human rights are for all of us. One solution. So while our panelists share their solution, could you just write down your solutions as well, or any food for thought you feel from this session? So let me give it to in the same sequence as we started. Shamishta, you first, and then Kevin, Daniel, Sandeep, and Martin. Just take 1 minute. Your top solution.
Great, thank you so much, Rishi. It's tough to narrow it down to one, but I think I'll echo a point that Vijay put in the Q&A chat, which is around stakeholder engagement and stakeholder dialogue. I think businesses need to understand, engage, and enable critical voices to raise concerns around potential and actual impacts, and that will in the end benefit their human rights due diligence that they conduct and the actions they take to address, identify their salient human rights issues. So they really need to consider the risks that critical voices may face, engage constructively and in good faith with those voices. And those include people like human rights defenders, trade union representatives, community members, and most importantly, workers on the ground. So with that, I'll pass over to Kevin.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. My suggestion is really brief, actually. I think companies conducting human rights due diligence, they should try to use tailor-made strategies to build the capacity of suppliers and others in the supply chain. Like, we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. It should be tailored to different companies, different industries, different, you name it. And if I may add to that, then, because I have a minute anyways, I think companies, they should understand how business and human rights differs from narrow conceptions of CSR or corporate sustainability. And maybe it would be good in that respect to really look at the guiding principles and what is expected of them.
Kevin, Daniel, Sandeep, and then...
Thank you. Businesses have leverage that workers and human rights defenders do not have. They use that leverage very well in advocating governments to deregulate, lower taxes, etc. I think a human rights due diligence process should indicate to the company where it has leverage to encourage governments to adopt human rights regulations and environmental regulations. And it should also identify bottom lines that they communicate to the government and say, if we don't have this minimum standard, for example, an independent judiciary, we cannot work here. Or if there is a conflict emerges, we cannot work here. There needs to be clear bottom lines for responsible exit.
Thank you, Daniel. Sandeep, and then Martin.
Two quick ones. One, as I said earlier, I think we need to empower workers to voice about these violations, whether through HRDD process, which I'm not an expert in, or outside. They should be part of this process too. And second, I think some of these HRDD initiatives, which I do believe are good ones as described today, should be also industry-wide. And I don't know if they already are, again, forgive me. In individual businesses, yes, but can we create a level playing field in terms of due diligence too, so that everybody walks together and doesn't create competitive pressures?
Thank you, Sandeep. Martin, your last thought, and then I'll close the session.
Rishi, what I think that all the stakeholders and the agencies should work together for at their best to have the HRDD.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. I have got many comments and solutions coming in. I would like to read some of them. Adarsh, can you open the last poll of the session? I request all participants to take part in this quick poll while I'll read out some solutions which have come out. Ensuring of laws, as some of our participants are saying, having an open source traceability tool, mapping of the supply chain. We're looking at collaborative and shared frameworks of due diligence. We're looking at using of technology, for example, in terms of grievances and collecting feedback from workers. We want to look at more transparency and looking at training, building more capacity on HRDD. We want to maximize government engagement. We want to leverage buying power of large companies on education, for example, and also to look at change. How do we look at HRDD for change? Please participate in this last poll of the session. It's been wonderful talking to all of you. Thanks so much to the panelists for bringing out your experiences, your voices. I think the discussion was quite enriching from my viewpoint. I'm sure participants enjoyed the discussion, learned something from it. I did learn a lot. There are many questions which came in. So one-way technology, did save us and it helped the session to move along. Nothing major happened. But thanks a ton for joining. I would have the last comment about HRDD is here to stay. Certainly there's more work that needs to be done at all levels of the value chain. And that's actually also the focus of the next 10 years of the UN guiding principles. And I would really request, all of us to get cracking on it. I think a lot of work needs to be done. I wish you all stay safe, stay well wherever you are, enjoy the moments, be grateful. Last year has taught us the value of relationships, the value of human conversation. So let's continue that. I wish you well and hope to see you all soon again. Take care.
Bye. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.